It's a sad fact that the English that millions of people learn in classrooms all over the world doesn't often match the reality of English outside the classroom. One person who knows the reality of English as a global language is Heather Hansen. She teaches professionals from the world's biggest companies how to successfully communicate in English all over the world. And the secret to successful global communication? Well, it's not about speaking like a native speaker or having an RP accent or using standard English. This is a powerful interview, and I hope that it will make teachers and students question their assumptions. This is an edited version of our interview. If you would like to listen to the full version, you will find a link down in the description box, where you will also find a link to Heather's TED Talk and her website. I hope you enjoy it. Heather Hansen, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to discuss all of this with you.
The moment that somebody says to me, I work in a communications kind of company that specializes in like corporate training, of course, all of the immediate associations are, she's the kind of person who wants people to speak perfect English with like the posh accent and, you know, with perfect grammar. But actually, that's not what you're about at all, right?
Not at all, but I wasn't always that way, Christian. It was actually one of my clients that woke me up a little bit. I was about 2 years into my business out here in Singapore. He was president of Greater Asia of a large American multinational. And he had called me in to help him with pronunciation and presentation skills. So in our consultation and everything, we talked about that. And, I noticed a lot of grammar errors, right? Big no-nos. And I thought, ooh, this is very bad. And I said, now what about your grammar? Very tactfully, what about your grammar? Is there anything you'd like to talk about with that or look at? And he just looks at me like, what's wrong with you? You got my grammar. I don't care about my grammar. As long as people understand me, that's good enough. And I mean, for an English teacher, and this is me, over 10 years ago, it was like getting stabbed in the heart. Like, what do you mean you don't care about grammar? That can't be right. You have to speak properly, right? But that was when my eyes were opened in that one statement where I thought, you know what? You're right. It doesn't matter. As long as you're understood, that's all that matters. You're sitting here, the president of Greater Asia for an American multinational. You bring in more money in your region than actually the whole American company. And yeah, obviously your grammar doesn't really matter, does it? Because everybody understands you. They know what you want and what you need. And you're an effective leader. You are effective in your communication. And that is what is important. And that was what really took me off in another direction, where I started really seriously studying English as a lingua franca, as a common language, how we were using English across borders, how English was really being used in real life business, because it isn't spoken out of a textbook. I don't speak with an RP accent. I don't even know what my accent is. I go home and they tell me I talk funny. So who knows, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think some of the interesting things that you talk about, like on your website and also in the videos that I've seen you in, is the fact that now that English is a global language, nobody kind of owns it anymore, and maybe that's a difficult concept for a lot of teachers and to kind of accept.
It's such a complex issue. It's really a whole industry issue, and I know that you've said this as well, in some of your previous videos and statements. But it's from the top down. The whole industry is broken. We've been enculturated to think a certain way. We've been told by our teachers, by our bosses, by our parents, that speaking proper English and a certain kind of English is the only way to be successful. And to a certain degree in our societies, because we've all been raised with those ideas, It also, we see it mirrored in society. So yes, the hiring manager is only going to hire you if you have good grammar and you have the right accent. We, within our own native languages, within the US, of course, we have so many different accents. And we know that if you have the Southern Belle accent and you try to make it in New York, I have a close colleague who now lives in the UK. She lived in New York in a very male dominated business with a very strong Southern Belle accent. And she said no one took her seriously. This isn't just a native speaker, non native speaker kind of thing. We do it in our own languages. And I think every language does it to some degree. We have this massive, almost invisible discrimination going on around accent, what it means, and what kind of identity you have, whether you're educated or not, whether you're rich or not, what kind of socioeconomic status you have. And it's so deeply ingrained that we don't even know it's there. And that's the whole problem, because teachers then take it into the classroom without realizing it's there. When a student comes and says, I want to sound like a native speaker, I want to speak like a native speaker, they don't even realize the underlying discrimination and how dangerous that statement is. And then they end up doing things and saying things that reinforce it. And they don't even realize it because this isn't really being talked about. There are those of us in the know, the researchers, the people in the ivory towers are talking about this. You know, the people at the top levels of the teaching associations, we talk about this all the time. But there are thousands, if not millions, of teachers out there who have just, gone off to get their CELTA or whatever teaching credential, and maybe haven't ever learned that actually out in the big wide world, it's a little bit different. But everything is context specific as well. A learner learning English in America or in the UK is going to have different needs and wants than an English learner in Singapore or somebody, in India or anywhere in Europe, for example. So it is a very complex topic, subject, discussion. We could be here all day talking about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think another thing that maybe would be surprising for people to learn is the ratio between the amount of people who are native English speakers and the amount of people who use English every day as a second language.
Yeah. And it's basically 5 to 1. I mean, we have about 400 million native speakers, and we're now estimating around 2 billion non-native who are learning the language. And even these statements of native and non-native, they're so arbitrary now. Technically, according to textbooks, we would consider Singaporeans to be non-native English speakers. But that's kind of ridiculous, because if you ask any of them, they'll say that's their best language. They've grown up with 3, 4, 5 languages, dialects, everything else. They operate in English. It's their business language, their education language. And yet they're classified linguistically as non-native speakers. Well, who exactly creates those classifications? Just because they weren't born speaking English and they started using English when they went to daycare or started in kindergarten, then that means actually, no, they're not native. It's very, very arbitrary. So I don't even like using the terms, but unfortunately, we don't have any new terms to use instead. And we need to come up with that. Sometimes I'll say, advanced speakers versus intermediate or learners, or I don't know. It's a difficult one. We still don't have words for it. But the people who are learning English as a second, third, fourth, fifth language, we know that there are about 2 billion of those. And the great, great majority of English conversations in the world today are between people who do not have English as their first language. We know that. We know that in business. Any room I walk into in Singapore, it is truly English as a lingua franca. It is people with maybe 5 different ethnic backgrounds, 5 different first languages, and we're using English as our common language to communicate. And when that is the situation, the rules are very different than what you learned in your textbook. And I think that we're shortchanging our students and our learners when we aren't making that very clear to them and preparing them for the real world and international English and global English settings.
But what about the critics and for me, these are the voices that I see all the time whenever I make content about this subject. Is they say, well, we can't just accept bad English because then it's going to kind of ruin English. Or if we accept that people can kind of speak however they want, then how are we all going to understand each other?
Yeah, it's like the doomsday scenario, right? Like nobody's going to be able to speak English anymore. Yeah, I've had a lot of negative feedback about this as well, especially after my TEDx, which is titled 2 Billion Voices, How to Speak Bad English Perfectly. And everybody says, oh, but we can't accept bad English. It's like, well, listen to the talk, because that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that when people come to me and say, Heather, fix me. My English is so bad. It's so horrible. And I sit there and have to question them and challenge them on that and say, what do you mean it's bad? I understand everything you're saying. You're communicating perfectly well. You're the you're the CFO of a Fortune 500 company. What do you mean you have bad English, right? The definition of bad and good has been so warped. And like I was saying, it's input they've received from other people, from teachers, from bosses, from colleagues, from friends. I think about even when I speak Danish, the kind of ridicule I get on my Danish accent. It's pretty horrible, right? I have a very strong American accent on my Danish, and everyone points it out to me. So I really understand that feeling, and I can understand why a learner would say, I want to sound like a native speaker. But it usually does not mean they want to sound like an American or a Brit. They usually don't even know what that means. If I ask them, which accent do you want? They say, oh, well, I want to sound like you. I want to sound British. I'm American, right? I mean, often they don't even know the difference between the accents. What they really want, if you dig a little bit deeper and you have a conversation with them, what they really want is to speak clearly. They want people to understand them. They want to have respect. They want to belong. These are the things they really want. It has nothing to do with how they sound. And but going back to your question, since I'm taking us off track, this argument of you're going to ruin the language, that's really not what it's about. Of course, we all have the rules of grammar in English. We all need to reach an intermediate level to be able to really work and do business in English. But once we've hit that level, then it becomes more about the clarity, and the simplicity of the language, not using the huge flowery words, not using the idioms. Oh my gosh, how English teachers love to teach idioms, and they hate it when I say stop teaching idioms. Why are we teaching this? Like, yes, okay, if you want to understand, then I'll teach it. And when a student begs me for idioms, I'll say, okay, I'll teach you some idioms. Promise me you will never, ever use them. I don't ever want to hear them come out of your mouth. I will teach them to you so you can understand all the native speakers who do not know how to communicate properly in international settings. Because native speakers are the ones who go in and use all the idioms, the sports analogies, all of the slang. And the reason the non-natives feel that they need to learn those things is because they're getting lost in the conversation. But what really needs to happen is all the people with English as a first language who go into these discussions, and even very high level advanced second, third, fourth language speakers, they need to go into these situations and remember to accommodate and adapt to the people in the room. It's a two-way street. It's not a competition of who has the biggest vocabulary. It's a competition around who can be the best understood and do the best deal and get business done. That's what we need to be focused on. We absolutely are not ruining the language. We're not stripping it of all its royal finesse. We are simply trying to communicate. That should be the goal of every interaction. And people who are speaking with each other, they're defining what that means in that moment, in that context. Whether, a Chinaman speaking to a Frenchman is going to speak English completely different than, a Dane speaking with an Indonesian here in Singapore, or a Korean speaking with a German in France. I mean, you're defining the language and creating that understanding in that context. And we have to look at it that way. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think I went off on about 3 other topics within that answer. But it's all tied together, it really is. But bottom line, no, we aren't ruining the language. Nothing's going to happen to English. We should be celebrating the fact that we're open to hearing more voices, and we're learning more about the world around us, because finally, other people have a voice. And I think it's important we stop to listen to those voices, no matter if they're grammatically correct or not, correct from the textbook definition, right?
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with everything you've said, and I think One of the really interesting things that you talk about is that in a conversation or in any setting where English is being used, as a kind of tool for communication, there's a responsibility not just on the person speaking, but also there's a huge responsibility on the listener.
Right. Um, it's funny because I don't think people realize how accents work. You know, the more contact that you have with an accent, the easier it becomes to understand. When I first landed in Singapore, it took me about 3 months to tune my ear to the accent here. I was completely unprepared. This was back in 2006 when I moved here the first time. And I was very unprepared for, I had heard they speak English. I was just expecting English. It's a very different kind of English. And it took me some time to tune my ear to it. But now I have absolutely no problem understanding anyone in Singapore, whether they're Malay or Indian or Chinese, and they all have slightly different ways of speaking. But, you know, the longer you have contact with an accent, the easier it is. So when an HR director of a Fortune 250 company calls me from Wisconsin and says, we want to hire a new CFO. We have an acting CFO. He's from France, but nobody can understand him. Quote, nobody can understand him. And I think that's odd because, he has to be pretty good to get to that level. And I say, well, send me his CV. I'd like to have a call. And I look at his CV. He lived 8 years in London, 12 years in Asia. But suddenly nobody can understand him in America. In little, who knows what town, Wisconsin, they can't understand him. And so I get him on the phone and sure enough, I'm like, wow, you're probably a better speaker than anyone I've ever coached. But you're in a very specific context. And if we don't do some things differently, you're going to lose your job. And that's what it came down to. That's how deep this accent discrimination is. Instead, what really needed to happen, and I mentioned this at the time, was let me come in and teach your top people how to better understand a French accent. We need more around accent understanding, accent recognition, instead of this idea of accent reduction, which I think is a very toxic word, because it shouldn't be about reducing anybody's accent or identity. But this is the problem, right? That when we take, this, using as an example, this small group of Americans who were listening to him and had no contact with other French speakers, weren't familiar with the accent, then he's very hard to understand. Whereas put him in a more international environment with people who are very familiar with the accent, and there's no issue at all. So this is why I'm a huge proponent of this argument that the listener needs to take some responsibility. We need to also tune our ears. If we want to be a part of the international community, speak with international people, do business across borders, then we also need to learn how to communicate, how to listen in a very different way. It's a different skill set than when you're at home having coffee with your family and friends in your community where you were born and raised. Because then that accent, when I go home, that does come out a bit more, my California Valley girl, right? But when I'm away, it's gone and forgotten. Because I've learned over time very naturally and organically that there were certain things I needed to change to be better understood myself, and also certain things I needed to listen for so I could better understand others. And that takes some time and effort. And when people go into a conversation assuming they have some ownership over the language, and I'm going to speak however I speak, it's your job to make me understand because you are the one speaking my language. And when that's the mentality, we run into big problems in global settings. And this is why all the research will even tell you that it's actually these native speakers going into international settings that are causing more problems in global business communication than the non-native speakers. They're doing great on their own, but enter a native speaker, the power dynamics change, the conversation changes, and the confidence levels of the people who do not have English as their first language decrease dramatically. So there are a lot of issues to address in those kinds of situations as well.
About a year ago, I had a really bizarre experience because sometimes I work as an interpreter, Spanish English, and I went with a Spanish guy to a conference, right? And obviously at the conference there was people from all over the world, and so they would speak to me in English, and then I would translate into Spanish for my client. And one of the people at the conference was was from the south of Spain, right? So he was speaking Spanish. So, and my client is Spanish. So they were perfectly capable of communicating with each other, right? It's the same country, the same language. But because I was there, my client um, kind of was just looking at me and waiting for me to translate the Spanish into my Spanish. So I was in this bizarre situation where someone was speaking to me in Spanish. I was repeating it in Spanish. And at that moment, that's when I was like, wow, if you don't make the effort to understand, you can even be lost even in your own language. It's just insane.
Yeah, it's really crazy. And I mean, and you definitely see that across the UK. I mean, the dialects are so incredibly different. Uh, and and that's what's even funny, is that all these textbooks and everything that come out of the UK and are all focused on this RP pronunciation, yet only what does David Crystal say? Something like 5% of the population, I think, actually speaks RP, right? So isn't this a disservice to our students if we are preparing them to go out in the world and all they can understand is RP English and they've been taught that that's the proper pronunciation? How on earth are they going to communicate with people, even within the UK? And this is a really big issue for teachers. I think a lot of teachers also have very little confidence teaching pronunciation because guess what? None of us sound like the CDs, we don't. None of us do. And and so I think a lot of teachers lose confidence when teaching pronunciation, and that is also a shame. Even the native speakers lose confidence because they have an accent that's different. But I would say, especially if you're in a country like the UK, you should be teaching the pronunciation, the variety of the language that is spoken in that area where those students are using it. That's what's important. That's what helps them to find belonging. That's what helps them to succeed in that society. But there's just so much discrimination around the way we speak and communicate. I find it really sad, and I think it's something that should be talked about a lot more, also at the corporate level in the area of diversity and inclusion. It's something that's forgotten. We talk about gender, we talk about race and ethnicity. We forget how language is also a massive problem when it comes to including people in their ideas and encouraging people to speak up and people having confidence to share their views when they sound different and are worried they'll face ridicule.
What advice would you like to give to all of those teachers who maybe have grown up, and they went through the training and they have these old-fashioned ideas really ingrained in their mentality about the objective is being like a native speaker with a specific accent, all that. I mean, what would you like to say to those teachers?
Well, first of all, I mean, it doesn't, for some of them, it doesn't matter what I say right now because they're still going to believe I'm wrong. And that's okay. That's okay. We have been indoctrinated. Our textbooks teach us this, our teachers teach us this, and we are privileged because of this. There's an enormous amount of colonial leftovers in all of this, an enormous amount of white privilege in maintaining this status quo that only proper standard English is correct, right? So this is why we're seeing a lot of pushback on these newer ideas, because it means that a lot of people are going to have to give up their power and have an acceptance for others. So there's a huge group of people who won't listen to me no matter what I say. For the teachers who are sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, I never even thought of it like this, then it is about starting to question your assumptions, right? It's about saying, why do I feel that a native accent is better? What is it about a native accent or standard English that I think is so much more important than just basic intelligibility and understanding? Start questioning the textbook, start questioning what kind of communication people are actually using. I think it's just very common. A student walks in and says, I want to learn, I want to speak like a native. And they go, well, yeah, of course, everybody does, right? I mean, it's something they've never, ever stopped and questioned, because that's just the way it is. So it's not until, maybe hearing this, maybe watching my TEDx maybe, meeting another teacher or teaching in an international environment, it's not until then that you kind of open your eyes. It was the same for me. I never even thought about it until I came to Singapore and was faced with a very international environment and had my own client tell me that grammar doesn't matter. Before I was like, what? What? Huh? Um, so it takes some kind of moment to have that assumption challenged and then to start thinking about it and processing it. So it's a process. But there's a lot of information out there around English as a lingua franca, a lot more now than 15 years ago. But the that's what's scary is the research has been around forever. I mean, it's been like 30 years that Jennifer Jenkins has been researching this, and many others. And I know you did an interview with her as well. So I think if they haven't seen that, they need to go and look at the interviews you've done with David Crystal, with Jennifer Jenkins. I mean, these are the heroes. I mean, make these people your heroes and learn everything that they teach, because they know what they're talking about. They've done the research. It's just that because the way our industry is designed, that research stays in the ivory towers. I have Jennifer Jenkins' book on my bookshelf. I have all it, but they're academic books. They cost like $100 a pop. No English teacher earning under $20 an hour can afford those books. The whole system is organized in a way that maintains this status quo, from the testing to the publishing to the teaching. It is all there indoctrinating us to think a certain way and to teach our students in a certain way. And I think it's very refreshing to see more and more teachers now challenging that status quo. I think it must be challenged. It's outdated, and it really needs to change. So for the teachers out there who are to open to considering this alternative, start reading about it, start learning about it, start listening, join the associations, join IATEFL, join TESOL, get into those groups and learn more about it, and especially about the cultural side of language and international usage, because that's really where we're using the language now more than in the native speaking countries. Really, the great majority of people are dealing with other people learning English.
That was kind of advice for teachers, but obviously there's also, as you've kind of mentioned before, there's billions of people who are in a classroom learning, the students, and they've also been indoctrinated in a similar way to have needs and desires. So what would you like to say to maybe the students who think that the objective is native and textbook and perfect accent?
My heart always goes out to these learners. Also because, I've been in a situation of speaking foreign languages. I have a bachelor's in German. I studied in Austria and Switzerland. I worked in Switzerland. I lived in Denmark 8 years and learned Danish. And I really know what that feels like. I'm sure you do too with Spanish. I know what it feels like to actually be discriminated against because of my accent. I know what it feels like to walk into a store and have them assume I'm Danish because my ancestry is actually Scandinavian. So I look like them, but then I open my mouth and it's just complete confusion on their faces, because it's like, whoa, wait, what? Wait, where are you from? It's like, where am I from? I asked you to show me that shirt, like, why are we getting into this? I really get it. I understand where that want comes from, to want to belong, right? I think that's really what it's about. It's wanting to belong and not always have pointed out to you that you're different, that you're an other, that you're from somewhere else. So I do understand that. But I think that we all need to be confident in the fact that we can belong and remain unique. We can belong and keep our own identities, our own cultures. Our accents hugely define who we are. What if I were to say and go along with this story that RP is the only accent and I can't teach pronunciation unless I have an RP accent. So I go and study and I change my accent to an RP accent. What on earth would that say about me, right? And it's funny because we don't think about it. Like, people would say, well, no, you're American. Why would you ever change? But okay, you're German. Why would you ever change? You're, You're Chinese. Why would you change? It's a part of you. It identifies you. It identifies your history. Some people will say, I don't want to identify with that history. Everyone has very different stories, very different needs. But I would say to all of them, I just think we so desperately need global voices. We so desperately, especially right now in the world, we need opinions and arguments and debates, and we need culture. We need to know different ideas. We need to hear different people speaking up than the status quo. And the only way we can do that is by having them have that confidence to speak up and speak in their own voices, and see the beauty in that. How boring would this world be if everyone sounded like you and me? It would be awful. Um, and so I hope, my hope is always to give confidence to these learners, to help them to build their confidence, to let them know that what they believe is their bad English is not bad at all, that there's no such thing as good and bad when it comes to language. It's about connection. It's not about perfection. And they need to just focus on that, and on the relationship and the connection they create with a person. And it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be textbook. And in fact, that could hurt them in the long run, because nobody really talks like that. So that's what I try to prepare them for, and say, you know what? No, I'm not going to teach you that kind of English, because when you go out in the world, that's not the way people speak. So it's about giving them the reality of how English is being used, introducing them to all different accents. Tell them to, I love to say, find an idol that you have from your own country, somebody who's very famous, who goes on TV and does interviews in English. Listen to their accent. They're perfectly intelligible. You look up to that person, that sports star, that movie star, that politician, whoever it might be. Listen to how they speak. Do they sound American? Do they sound like they're speaking the Queen's English? No. And they can be proud of that accent. That is their identity. And anyone in the world knows that woman is German, that man is Spanish. And that's okay. That's okay. That's what makes it interesting.
I can't believe it's taken me so long to have a conversation with you. That's how I'm really feeling right now.
Oh, we're soulmates, Christian.
I just, you're speaking to my heart right now. It's unbelievable, and it just makes me happy to know that there's people out there like you who are talking about these things, and not just that, but like your platform, like you're talking to people in high places, and I think it's I just feel like that that people are. Well, actually, David Crystal said this to me. He said that, because I was complaining about how is it possible that we're still in this mess. Basically, I was complaining to him about it. He said, Christian, you have to remember that global English is, relatively speaking, a pretty new phenomenon, and we're all trying to adjust. And I just wish people would hurry up and adjust.
I know. They need to hurry up and adjust.
Like, it's been long enough. Like, we're in the postmodern kind of English period now. The world is different. Like you said, it's 2 billion people. It's not 100,000. It's 2 billion. Like, we need to wake up.
Yeah, colonialism is over. And I think people need to remember the history of language and the relationship between language and power. English language has been used as a dominating force in the world for many, many years. And we've gotten rid of colonialism, but we haven't gotten rid of the whole entire mindset around it. This is old-fashioned thinking, and we can't continue to try to use language as a source of power, and to maintain our privilege as native speakers. I have the goal of helping all these amazing leaders I work with in Asia. I want to see them running these massive companies. I want to see more of them on these platforms. We talk about getting women on the boards. What if we look at the boards of the Fortune 500s? How many of the individuals on those boards are non-native speakers? It's quite shocking. When you look at even the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, it's only something like 10 or 11% that are not that do not have English as their first language. And that's a little bit scary. It means that this white privilege, we are still dominating the world. The native speaker paradigm is dominating the world from a not only linguistic perspective, but a power perspective. And that's where it gets very, very dangerous. And I hope that with the changes that we're seeing in the world today, that we will also wake up to the fact that our mindsets around language have to change. And that's the only way we can move forward, that we can truly be global, that we can really accept others, that we can be truly inclusive, is that we have to let go of these ideas of ownership over English, the power that English provides us, and the privilege it provides us. I mean, I am very, very aware of that. I'm very aware that one of the main reasons probably I've been so successful in Asia is because of the way that I look and the way that I speak. And as hypocritical as that is, I feel that that puts an extra responsibility on me to share this message and to make sure it changes. Because I know the reason I've been put in the position I'm in is due to this very warped reality and belief and indoctrination around the fact that the way I speak and the way I look is better than here. And that's absolutely wrong. And so I have to use the position I've been given now to continually talk about this and try to change things, because if we don't change it, who will, you know? And that's why I think it's so important for the teachers to really have an understanding of this. Also, this fight against non-native teachers and this whole native non-native divide in teaching, and schools that only hire someone because they were born in the right country. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. They aren't teachers, they don't have any qualifications, but because they sound like me, they can be a teacher. It's insane. It's insanity. And so that's what I mean by the whole entire industry is a mess. And the way that we look at language and the way that we continue this horrible system of privilege around English, and we've got to change it. And I don't know how. I think it's conversations like this that hopefully move the bar just a little bit, but it's going to take a long time.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, look, I'm in a similar position. You know, I came to Spain, and 10 years ago, I didn't know anything about language. I literally, like, I didn't know the difference between a noun and an adjective. And what did I do? I rented a space, I put up a Union Jack, and I started teaching. You know, I mean, how unfair is that? And people came to me. They're like, "Oh my God, he's a native speaker. Oh my God, let's send our children to have classes with him." And in fact, so it may be in a similar way to you, like the self-awareness of the privilege that I had, seriously unfair privilege. You know, it's taken me 10 years to kind of to come to terms with that. And so now, you know, similar to you, I want to use my platform to say, hey, you know, this isn't fair. Let's not do that anymore, because I don't think any other industries would accept it. You know, it's like, you know, we don't send engineers to build bridges if they've never studied engineering for a single day. Like, it's just not fair.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Isn't that crazy? It's crazy. It's crazy that we can get away with this, but it shows how backwards society still is when it comes to this, you know, and how much this colonial mentality is still here. And you know, there's a lot of economics in it as well. Wherever the money is, the power is. But you know, let's see, the centers of influence are shifting very quickly. So you never know what will happen. But I don't think English is going anywhere, primarily because it's so widespread due to colonialism. It's so widespread. You know, China, of course, has billions of speakers, but it's only spoken in China. So in order for a language to become a lingua franca, it has to be widespread. I mean, Spanish, one of the fastest growing languages, spoken in a lot more areas of the world. Maybe that could one day one day be a rival. But really, yeah, it's very scary. I love that example of we don't send an engine. You don't send someone to go build a bridge if they haven't studied engineering. That's a really good analogy, because it's exactly that. It's exactly that, and we can't allow this to continue. And I have had critique for that as well. You know, where you know, on my TEDx, and people saying, "Oh, the irony, right? You know, the white Westerner saying that we need to respect." You know, and it's the same that we see in gender, that that argument that, oh, well, you're a man, so how can you talk about feminism? It's like, just because I'm not a non-native doesn't mean I don't understand the challenges. Especially, I think that teachers who speak additional languages, I think we understand the challenges more. And I think that we're usually a lot quicker to accept this idea of English as a global language because we've lived it. We really do understand the challenges they're facing, and the discrimination they face when they speak a foreign language. Um, so yeah, I do believe we have a right to talk about it, and I do believe that we are the ones who have to talk about it because it's the people who have the power who have to change it, and it won't change until we stand up and say this isn't right. And that's the perspective I come from with this, and I'm very happy that I got to meet you and hear that you're on the same page, because I think that there are a lot of us out there. There are more than you would believe, of teachers who have always felt this way, who have been teaching this way for 10, 15, 20 years. They aren't, and I think the teachers who don't necessarily agree with us, I don't think it's any fault of their own. I really don't. Um, it's just the way we've been taught. So yeah, it's going to take some time, but hopefully this conversation gets us one little baby step closer.
I really hope so. Well, look, I just want to say thank you for your for sharing your passion, because it's just so obvious. Your passion is bleeding out of every pore.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I feel very, very strongly about it. And some days I'm angry about it, some days I'm sad about it. But what can we do? We have to just keep doing what we do and help as many people as we can and build their confidence. And seeing one of my clients go and get 25 million in funding from the board of directors in America who have never shown him any respect. Those are the big wins where I think, okay, we can do this. We can make these changes, and it really doesn't matter what level they're at. It's just as important for the student getting up to give their presentation for their final exam, to be able to give them that confidence to stand up and do that and be successful and understand that, yeah, they're good enough. I mean, who are we to say you're not good enough? It's just, yeah, the bad English, it's good enough. You're good enough. And don't be afraid to share your message with the world. We need it. We really need it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christian.